For generations, her songs defined love, loss, and longing, an intimate soundtrack for millions. But behind the smoky voice and poetic lyrics was a different story. One of contracts written in shadows, betrayals whispered in hotel hallways, and a fame that became its own prison. Carly Simon was the voice of an era. But now, the question isn't just who inspired her most famous song. It's what happened when the music stopped and the silence began to speak. Long before the platinum records and whispered scandals, Carly Simon was just a girl who couldn't stop stammering. In the brownstone-lined streets of Riverdale, New York, she spoke with halts and hesitations so sharp that classmates would mimic her until she cried. But there was one strange, miraculous escape from the stutter: singing. When words were bound tight in her throat, melodies flowed like silk. Her father, Richard L. Simon, co-founder of the publishing giant Simon & Schuster, was a towering presence in both stature and shadow. He adored music, filled the home with records, and taught his daughters to see literature and melody as inseparable arts. But his success was also a cage. In the rarefied circles of Manhattan's elite, appearances were everything, and any flaw, be it a stutter or a scandal, had to be hidden behind smiles. Her mother, Andrea, was a figure both nurturing and inscrutable. To the neighbors, she was the elegant wife of a publishing magnate. To Carly, she was a woman with a secret life. Years later, Carly would confess that her mother had a romantic relationship with another man, openly, in the same home. It was a revelation that would ripple through Carly's sense of trust for decades. As a child, Carly dreamed of Broadway stages, but something in her knew she wasn't cut from the chorus line. She began writing songs in a spiral notebook, pouring in all the words she couldn't speak aloud. And then came the death that cracked her family apart. Richard Simon died suddenly when Carly was only 15. One day, her father's booming laugh filled the dining room. The next, silence. Without his guiding hand, Carly drifted. She found herself drawn not to debutante balls, but to Greenwich Village coffeehouses, the places where poetry mixed with protest songs, where no one cared about her stutter if the lyrics hit deep. By her early 20s, she had formed the Simon Sisters with her older sibling Lucy. They sang folk harmonies in tight, delicate braids of sound, but as the 60s waned, folk's sweetness gave way to something sharper, and Carly knew she had to stand on her own. The first steps were shaky. Rejection letters piled up. Industry men told her she was too patrician for pop, or too awkward for the stage. But one night, at a tiny club, she sang an original ballad that silenced even the clinking of glasses. The room leaned forward. People felt something in her voice that was raw and confessional. Less like performance, more like confession. That night, Carly Simon was no longer the shy girl from Riverdale. She was a woman who could make strangers feel their own heartbreak through her own trembling voice. She walked home alone, coat pulled tight against the Manhattan wind, and whispered to herself, "They will know my name." What she didn't know yet was that the songs she would write, the ones that made her a household name, would also expose secrets she thought she could control. And some of those secrets would belong to people far more powerful than she imagined. The Hamptons in the early 1970s were a glittering mirage. Salt air tangled in the scent of money, where bonfire parties and private beach houses were as common as hangovers. Carly moved there for the same reason many artists did, to find quiet inspiration while staying close enough to the industry's beating heart. By then, she had signed with Elektra Records. The label believed in her sultry alto and confessional lyrics, but they also saw her as marketable. Tall, striking, with a sly smile that could sell both a record and a fantasy. Publicists leaned into the image of the sophisticated siren by the sea. Behind closed doors, Carly was still battling insecurities, still half convinced that every hit was an accident. In the Hamptons, though, she met everyone: musicians, painters, politicians, and the occasional movie star. Some of them would drift in and out of her songs, disguised only by a change in name or detail. This habit of weaving real people into her lyrics would become both her greatest artistic strength and the seed of future feuds. One summer evening, she was invited to a party in Montauk, where Bob Dylan was rumored to appear. Dylan never showed, but Carly found herself in conversation with James Taylor, a lanky, soft-spoken North Carolinian whose voice was as gentle as the wind coming off the water. By midnight, they were playing guitar together in the corner, ignoring the chaos around them. By morning, they were inseparable. The Hamptons became their refuge, but also their theater. Tabloids were already circling, and industry insiders whispered about the golden couple of the singer-songwriter movement. Carly was in love, but she also knew that every relationship, especially one between two rising stars, came with an expiration date. It was also in the Hamptons that Carly began writing the song that would define her career. It started as a half-finished verse in a leather notebook, a portrait of a man so obsessed with himself he couldn't see the woman next to him. She didn't know it yet, but that single song would follow her for the rest of her life, sparking decades of speculation, misdirection, and quiet phone calls from very famous men who wanted to know if it was them. The Hamptons looked like a dream from the outside, but in the long shadows cast by those perfect cedar-shingled homes, Carly Simon was about to step into a storm of her own making. By late 1971, Carly Simon was no longer just another hopeful singer-songwriter. The shy, awkward young woman who once doubted her place in the industry was now deep into recording her second album, a make-or-break moment in a career still finding its shape. Among the tracks in progress was one she couldn't quite finish. It had started as a sketch in her notebook, playful but edged with steel. The verses came easily, wry portraits of a self-absorbed man seen through the eyes of someone who'd loved and lost him. The melody skipped and teased, hiding its bite beneath a pop-perfect veneer. But the chorus eluded her. It needed a sharper hook, something so pointed it would pierce the ego of anyone who heard it. Then, in a recording session with producer Richard Perry, it happened. The phrase tumbled from her lips almost without thinking. "You're so vain. You probably think this song is about you." The room went still. Perry's eyes widened. Musicians stopped mid-note. It wasn't just catchy, it was dangerous. It was the kind of line that turned a song into a mirror, one that forced listeners to confront the possibility that it might be aimed at them. When You're So Vain hit the airwaves in November 1972, it was like striking a match in a room filled with gasoline. Within days, it shot to #1, staying there for weeks. Radio DJs played it on endless loop. People sang it in cars, in kitchens, in bars. And almost immediately, the guessing game began. Was it Mick Jagger, who had famously sung backup on the track? Cat Stevens, her ex? Chris Christopherson, rumored to have been smitten with her? Or Warren Beatty, Hollywood's consummate ladies' man? Newspapers, gossip columns, and late-night shows all joined in. The mystery became a sport. Carly only stoked the fire. In interviews, she smiled slyly, never confirming, never denying. She hinted at clues, but kept the heart of it locked away. The reality was messier than the public imagined. The verses were composites, drawn from different men and different encounters. But the chorus, those 8 razor-sharp words, were aimed squarely at one man, and he knew it. Not long after the song's release, he called her. His voice was tight, brittle. "Thanks for the song," he said. before hanging up. No laughter, no charm, just a warning edge. Friends whispered that she'd made a dangerous enemy. Others said she'd just secured her place in pop history. But with the hit came something else, an unintended shift in her image. The world no longer saw Carly solely as the vulnerable poetess. She was now the sly avenger, the woman who could slice you open with a rhyme and a smile. People wanted gossip, not just music. And slowly, Carly realized her career was no longer entirely hers. It belonged to the machine, a machine that fed on intrigue, on rumors, on the slow drip of secrets. She made a choice. The full truth would never come out. Even decades later, when she offered a single clue to a charity auction winner that one verse was about Warren Beatty, she kept the rest sealed. But secrecy, she would learn, is never free. As the 70s wore on, Carly would discover that some of those she trusted most had been keeping secrets of their own, secrets capable of turning her golden world into something far darker. Marriage to James Taylor should have been a fairy tale. Two of the most beloved singer-songwriters of the 1970s, both at the top of their game, bound together by music, passion, and a shared belief in the purity of their craft. To the public, they were a romantic duet come to life. Two voices, two guitars, two souls moving in perfect harmony. When they performed together, the chemistry was undeniable. Magazine covers called them the golden couple of folk rock. Fans imagined candlelit songwriting sessions and a love story written in melodies. But behind the closed doors of their home on Martha's Vineyard, the reality was far more fragile. James, gentle and self-effacing in interviews, was privately waging war against demons, heroin, depression, and a restless instinct to run. Carly adored him, but she could feel the distance growing, even in moments that were supposed to be intimate. Conversations became shorter. Absences grew longer. She poured her confusion and grief into her lyrics, turning her journal entries into melodies. But while she saw them as warnings, the public consumed them as just another layer of entertainment, proof that even heartbreak could be commodified. The betrayals came in two forms. Some were whispered about in the back rooms of recording studios. Rumors carried on cigarette smoke and late-night phone calls. Others were so public, they landed in the pages of Rolling Stone, turning private pain into pop culture spectacle. Friends would call her in hushed voices, telling her where they'd seen James, who he had been with. Carly, already under the constant shadow of speculation over "You're so vain," now lived in a second-guessing game. Which of her husband's disappearances were innocent, and which were not? Their marriage became a pendulum swing. Brief moments of reconciliation followed by longer stretches of retreat. On stage, they were still magnetic. Songs like Mockingbird brought audiences to their feet, the harmonies carrying an illusion of unity. But backstage, the silences were heavier than the music. James's addiction deepened, and Carly found herself slipping into multiple roles: nurse, manager, caretaker, while still trying to be a wife. By the early 1980s, they were a couple in name only. The warmth had drained from their home, replaced by a mutual exhaustion that neither of them could fix. When the divorce finally came in 1983, it was almost a relief. The legal papers were the final acknowledgement of what they had both known for years. The love story was over. But the separation left Carly standing in a strange new landscape. She had two young children to protect, a heart hollowed out by years of instability, and a career that suddenly felt like it belonged to another era. The industry was changing, faster than she could adapt. And slowly, an unsettling suspicion began to take shape, that some of the men in her life, not just James, had been quietly taking from her. Pieces of her royalties, pieces of her creative credit, pieces of her voice, negotiated away in boardrooms she was never invited into. And one of them, she would soon discover, was about to betray her in a way she could never have imagined. Carly's voice was still everywhere, floating from car radios, piped into department stores, echoing across concert halls, but the air around her felt increasingly suffocating. By the mid-1980s, the music industry was shifting beneath her feet. The warm, lived-in sound of acoustic strings was being pushed aside for glossy synthesizers. Substance was losing ground to spectacle. Record labels no longer wanted songs that unraveled slowly and cut deep. They wanted music videos, choreographed smiles, and artists who could look like they'd stepped off the cover of a fashion magazine. Carly's confessional style, the very thing that had made her a household name, was now considered passé. Executives began making suggestions that were really demands. Freshen up your image, tone down the intensity, make it shinier, less threatening, more compliant. The subtext was always the same: be younger, prettier, easier to market. The pressure was relentless. Magazine editors told her to lose 10 pounds before a cover shoot. Video directors urged her to smile more and sing to the camera like you're seducing it. Even her wardrobe was dissected, her posture analyzed, her expressions timed for maximum appeal. Every lyric she wrote was scrutinized, not for its artistry, but for its potential gossip value. The same press that had once crowned her a genius now seemed eager to write her obituary. If an album didn't climb to #1, they didn't just call it a disappointment. They called her washed up. It was as though she had been granted permission to exist only as long as she stayed at the top. She retreated to her home in the Hamptons, hoping the salt air and quiet would give her some breathing room. But even there, she was never truly alone. Paparazzi crouched in the dune grass with telephoto lenses. Strangers appeared at her front door, pressing fan letters into her hands, or sometimes muttering threats. The house filled with new locks and alarm systems, and Carly learned to scan the horizon before stepping outside. Still, there were moments of brilliance, flashes that reminded her, and the world, why she mattered. In 1987, her theme for Working Girl, Let the River Run, burst onto the scene like a clarion call. It became an anthem for a new generation of working women, bold and defiant in its optimism. The song earned Carly an Academy Award, a Golden Globe, and a Grammy. The first time in history, a single artist had won all three for a song they wrote, composed, and performed. She smiled through the ceremonies, posed for photos, thanked the right people, but inside, she felt the cost. Every new triumph only tightened the vice. Higher expectations, deeper scrutiny, less room to falter. Her diary from that era was filled with a quiet ache. I can't tell if I'm still singing because I love it or because I don't know what else to do. By the dawn of the 1990s, Carly Simon had money, fame, and respect, but also a creeping sense that the walls around her life were lined with velvet, not freedom. And when an unexpected letter arrived one quiet afternoon, those walls would begin to close in even tighter. It was delivered in a plain envelope, no return address. Carly thought it was fan mail at first. She received dozens every week. But when she unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, her chest went cold. The letter was blunt, cruel, and signed only with a single initial. It accused her of stealing a song, one of her biggest hits, from an unnamed source. It claimed to have proof and threatened to release it to the press unless she made a substantial donation to a private bank account. At first, she laughed it off. Blackmail wasn't new to celebrities. But when she called her attorney, he went quiet. There had been rumors, he admitted, that one of her collaborators from years earlier had been telling a very different version of how the song came to be. And if those rumors made it to the right journalist, they could turn into headlines that would haunt her for years. Carly was furious, partly at the letter's author, partly at herself. She had been in this business long enough to know that contracts were weapons and memories were malleable. Now, someone she had trusted was trying to rewrite history for profit. She didn't pay. Instead, she hired a private investigator. What he uncovered would shake her faith in nearly everyone around her. Old friends had been talking to tabloids. A former bandmate had sold off early demo tapes without her consent. And buried in a drawer in a music publisher's office was a contract that, if interpreted a certain way, could have stripped her of rights to one of her most iconic songs. The letter was the first blow. The real betrayal was yet to come. The betrayal came quietly, without warning, like a tide turning under the surface. It began with a phone call from her lawyer. A reissue of one of her classic albums, something that should have been a celebration, had been delayed. Rights disputes, he said vaguely. But when Carly pressed, the truth emerged. The label had been quietly selling licensing rights to her songs without her knowledge, exploiting clauses buried deep in decades-old contracts she'd signed in her 20s. She'd trusted them. Trusted the executives who called her family. Now she learned that her masters, her life's work, were being traded like poker chips in rooms she'd never been invited to enter. Even worse, the same executives were pushing younger artists to cover her songs while cutting her out of the promotional picture, reaping profits while erasing her from her own legacy. The music industry had a cruel rhythm: build them up, cash them in, and move on. By the mid-1990s, it was clear that the cycle had turned on Carly. Labels refused to fund her new projects unless she brought in outside producers who would modernize her sound. Younger A&R reps, kids who had been in grade school when You're So Vain topped the charts, now treated her like a relic, someone to be handled rather than celebrated. The media followed suit. Headlines shifted from praising her songwriting to speculating about her love life, her weight, and whether she'd had work done. Interviews became minefields, with reporters fishing for names behind her most famous song rather than asking about her current work. One night, after yet another meeting where her ideas were dismissed, Carly sat in her kitchen with a glass of wine and stared at her gold records. She realized something chilling. She'd been in this business for over 2 decades, but she owned less of her career now than she had at the start. The tide had turned, and now she would have to decide whether to fight it or let it pull her under. By the late 90s, Carly Simon had retreated from the spotlight. She still released music, but the promotional circus, the endless interviews, the tour buses, the magazine covers, was gone. Some of it was her choice. Some of it wasn't. The Hamptons home that had once been a gathering place for musicians and artists became a fortress. Carly planted hedges high enough to block the road, installed cameras, and learned to live with the constant hum of security systems. Paparazzi were no longer camped outside, but she felt their presence like a phantom ache. Inside, life slowed. Mornings were for writing, afternoons for walks along the beach. She cooked her own meals, answered her own phone. Friends said she seemed calmer, but in truth, she was wary. Too many people she had once let in, friends, collaborators, even lovers, had sold her out for a headline or a quick check. In her journals, she wrote about the loneliness of being famous but forgotten, about the strange pain of having the world know your name but no longer care about your voice. She described her home as a sanctuary and a prison, a place where she could finally be herself, but also where the world seemed content to leave her. Occasionally, she would step back into the public eye, a tribute concert, a guest appearance. Each time, the machine would roar back to life, reporters circling like sharks, industry contacts suddenly remembering her number. And each time, she would retreat again, shaken by how quickly old wounds reopened. Carly's exile was not total. She still had loyal fans, still received letters from people who said her songs had saved their lives. But in the quiet, she began to wonder, when the industry shuts the door on you, can you ever really come back? Or is the exile permanent? For decades, Carly Simon had been the keeper of her own mythology. She had decided which stories to tell, which names to reveal, and which wounds to leave in shadow. But in 2015, as she prepared to release her memoir, Boys in the Trees, she made a choice that shocked even her closest friends. In the pages of the book, she confirmed a secret she had kept for more than 40 years, that the second verse of You're So Vain was about Warren Beatty. The revelation made headlines worldwide. Interviewers scrambled to book her. Late-night hosts rehearsed their punchlines, and social media lit up with jokes and speculation about the other verses. But the memoir held more than celebrity gossip. Carly wrote candidly about her father's sudden death, her mother's affair, her battles with stage fright so severe she once fainted before a show. She described the collapse of her marriage to James Taylor in terms both tender and brutal, admitting to betrayals on both sides. And she revealed a lifetime of anxiety, panic attacks, claustrophobia, and the constant fear that her voice would fail her. The book was a bestseller, but it came at a cost. Some former friends stopped speaking to her. Others threatened legal action. Even Warren Beatty, when asked for comment, offered a wry, cutting line. Let's be honest, she thinks a lot of songs are about me. Still, Carly stood by her decision. She had spent decades letting others tell her story in fragments, rumors, and half-truths. Now, finally, the words were hers. In the years since her memoir, Carly Simon has lived mostly on her own terms. She still writes, still sings, but on a schedule that answers to no label, no contract, no producer. The industry that once controlled her now watches from the sidelines as she releases music when, and only when, she feels ready. She has faced loss, the deaths of close friends, the quiet unraveling of old collaborations, and the knowledge that her era of constant radio play is long past. But she has also found freedom in obscurity. Without the weight of chart positions or critical consensus, she can write songs for herself, for her children, for no one at all. Her home in Martha's Vineyard is filled with instruments, pianos, guitars, and the same old notebooks she has kept since she was a teenager. Visitors describe evenings where Carly will sit at the piano, light a candle, and play something so new and unpolished that it feels like being let in on a secret. She rarely talks about "You're So Vain" now. The guessing game no longer amuses her. If people want to know the rest of the names, they can keep guessing. Her real legacy, she insists, is not in a single song, but in a lifetime of work that dared to be personal, confessional, and unapologetically hers. And perhaps that is the final twist in Carly Simon's story. That after years of being defined by the men in her songs, by the rumors and revelations, she remains, above all, a voice. One that, no matter how many times the industry tried to silence it, still refuses to fade. What if the voice they tried to bury was never truly gone? Now that her story is in the open, we have to ask ourselves, do we let it fade into the static, or keep listening before the last note is lost to time? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.